Hi all, what's going on? I'm Ezrado, and today I'm finally reviewing Caravan Palace's 5th studio album, Gangbusters Melody Club. So it's been a while since I did my last review. I think it was back when I reviewed Chronologic, their previous album, back in 2019, but they're finally here with their 5th album, so I'm really excited to go through this one. I know it came out a couple of weeks ago, but I thought I'd wait until I got the physical CD in the mail just so I can go through it with you guys. So as you can see, this is a paperslip CD design as opposed to the usual plastic that you might see on many other CDs. Also really love this artwork. You've probably seen it by now, but these are basically the two producers of the band, along with the singer. And the classic robot face, of course. Then on the back, of course, we have our track listing, which, nothing really too out of the ordinary here. Although I really do like this color combination with the aqua and the cream-colored writing. It just has a real mid-century kind of look to it. Probably what you're more interested in, though, is the inside. First of all, we have this card here, which, to be honest, when I first bought this, I actually thought this was going to be a physical card that you could pull out, but it's actually printed onto the CD, so unfortunately I can't do that. Not that I'd be using for anything, but, just a fun little thing to put in your wallet, I guess. Apparently, the Japanese characters you see here translate to premium, according to my mum, who speaks a bit of Japanese. Not sure exactly what this number represents, nor these two lightning strikes, but if anyone has any ideas, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Then on the other side here, we have the names of all the band members, who I'm not going to say because I'll absolutely butcher their pronunciation. And then below that, some of the other collaborators, such as the instrumentalists and guest vocalists. Pulling it out further on this side, we get a little special thanks section, which seems to be mostly a lot of their family and friends, along with maybe some people they've worked with from the record label. And then in the middle, some nice alternative art to the front cover. In case you're interested in what the CD looks like, honestly, something too exciting, just the title of the album, really. And then probably the most exciting part, which, to be honest, I was quite surprised was exclusive to the album. Like, this doesn't come with the record, I don't believe, and that is a poster of the key art as well, as we can see here. I don't love the creases here, but I suppose there wasn't really any other way to package it into the album, and I still appreciate any kind of freebies that come with it, so yeah. So I guess the way I describe this album as a whole is that it's sort of a culmination of all of Caravan Palace's previous styles they've used in previous albums, all packed into one. Although I would say in particular, they mostly lean into the styles of the last two albums, Chronologic and Robot Face. With Chronologic, they really established this style of focusing on vocals more. And that's something you really see here as well. Not for every song, but with, a handful of songs, there is a bit more of a pop structure and a focus on vocals. And then for Robot Face, that was really when they started leaning heavily into their electronic inspirations, I would say. And you do notice that here as well. Like, all of these songs are very, electronically driven, unlike, say, the first two albums, where they still did maintain a little bit more of that jazz influence, which is still here, by the way, but just not quite to that extent. Now, I am actually going to do a track-by-track review on this one, which is something I haven't done in a while, but I do actually have a bit to say about this one, so let's get into it. So starting off with Mad, this one surprised me quite a bit. Originally, I had this idea that Caravan Palace would want to branch out a little bit more into a bit more of a mainstream sound. Here it's really, they've done the complete opposite. They've really leaned into the classic electro swing elements of some of their more classic tracks, which felt like a complete 180 as to what I was expecting from them. But to be honest, I'm not complaining. In fact, I was really happy to hear this because it sort of reassured me a little bit that, they really do care about the fans here and they want to create something that are going to please the fans right out of the gate with their leading single. With that being said, I find it interesting that they sort of blended this style with some of the conventions they established in the previous album, being very vocal driven and sort of having more of a pop structure. It's like they've taken this classic electro swing sound but then made it into a pop song, if that makes sense. A little bit like Lone Digger, I suppose, but yeah, maybe this was meant to be Lone Digger 2.0, I'm not sure. One sort of new mainstay addition, I guess, to the Caravan Palace sound, which starts with this song, I noticed, is the use of a baritone or a bass saxophone that's really at the forefront of the mix and gives it this really warm tone. This was something you heard in their last album, I believe, with Melancholia, about halfway through that song or so. They bring it in there, and they did have this sax in previous albums as well. But here there's something they've done with it in the mix which just really brings it to the forefront and gives it this really warm tone, which I really love. I'll move on to the next track in a moment, but just one more thing I wanted to mention here. I noticed this song, Mad, sounds a little bit like the fourth ID track from the Chill with Caravan Palace mix released a few years ago. I know the sound design's different, I don't think the chord progressions are exactly the same, but I don't know, there's a slither of an ID there in that track, and I'm like, I don't know, did that eventually evolve into this? Who knows? Would be interested again to hear your thoughts on what you think on that. Anyway, moving on to the second track on the album, which was also the third single to release, we have Mirrors. I'll be honest with you, when this first released, I was a little lukewarm to it. I don't know, I just felt the chord progressions, the sound design, a lot of the selection of drum samples just weren't that interesting to me, at least compared to a lot of Caravan Palace's other stuff. Eventually, I would grow to appreciate this a little bit more, I think largely thanks to Zoe's very catchy vocals, along with that really funky sax in the drop, which is impossible not to like. I also appreciate there's a bit of a lyrical theme to this one, which is about living in someone's shadow. Usually Caravan Palace don't really have many themes behind their lyrics, they're just sort of inaudible and, more contribute to the sound design, but, I appreciate it when it's there. Bit of trivia for you on this one, by the way. The vocal chops that you hear in between Zoe's vocals in the second half of the choruses that say yes ma'am and choo choo were actually sampled from a 1940s recording of a student in Mississippi named Ora Del Grayon. That original recording was called Little Girl, in case you're interested in looking it up. And not only did it sample for his vocal chops, but also the general cadence and rhythm, I would say, of Zoe's vocals are basically a modern take on this recording. So yeah, definitely check it out. Next up, 81 Special is the first non-single song of the album, and I was so excited to hear the full song of this ever since I heard it during the teaser on Caravan Palace's Instagram for the new album, and I'm happy to report it did not disappoint. Honestly, this is probably the most exciting track of the album for me, maybe even my favorite overall. What I love about this track is that it's really satisfying as an electro swing track, but at the same time, I don't think you need to really love electro swing as a genre to appreciate this and really get a lot out of it. It's just so funky and irresistible that, to me, it just feels impossible not to dance to, regardless of whether you usually listen to this kind of music or not. And it does that without watering down those jazzy influences, which I really appreciate. The drop of this track in particular just goes so hard. I love how well they've merged the electronic production with the brass in this section, paired with those really jazzy seventh chords. Honestly, I feel like this would go really hard in a club setting especially. Yeah, this might just be the most exciting track on the album, I reckon. Next up we have Raccoons, which to me is another highlight of the album. Honestly, really almost front-loaded the album with a lot of the hits. I think in particular, I really love that very catchy vocal hook in the chorus. I don't know what Zoe's saying there, but by darn, it's really catchy. I also really appreciate how Caravan Palace have broadened their influences, it seems, on this track. This reminds me a lot more of a kind of 70s soul track almost, as opposed to anything from the 1940s or 30s or, that era. And it's not entirely jazz, it feels almost erring in the funk direction maybe. In general, I honestly think this could be a great idea for Caravan Palace if they're thinking of evolving further in the future. Instead of just restricting themselves to, early 20th century jazz genres, if they went and looked at other genres that are kind of jazz adjacent, that could be a great way to evolve. I don't know, just my thinking. And speaking of other influences, I also really appreciate the strings in the middle of this track, which sort of have a bit of a classical feel to them. And not only that, but they really evolve the rest of the track from that point forward. And that's actually a theme I've noticed throughout this album. A lot of these tracks have like a midway turning point where from that point onwards, maybe the chord progression will change up or they'll add some additional sound design. And I don't know, I really think doing this really enriches and adds dimension to a lot of these tracks, which I really love. On a winning streak here, the next track, Avalanches, is probably another one of my favorites from the album. Just largely due to its euphoric chord progressions. Honestly, I feel like this is one of those tracks you could strip back, just play on piano, and it would still sound amazing, even without all the sound design. And speaking of that technique I mentioned before of the midway point, that's also something present here. You'll notice halfway through the track that there's this turning point that just totally transforms the rest of the track, and it really blossoms into something even more profound. It reminds me a little bit of what they did on Melancholia, actually, how, that had a real turning point where that entire track just transformed. It's maybe a little bit more overt there, but even still here, it's really euphoric, and I really love what they've done with that turning point moment and just how it affects the rest of the track going forwards. Melodic stuff aside, I also really love Zoe's very wistful, dreamy vocals on this one, along with those sort of barbershop quartet sections which come from vocalist Robin Mansanti, who you might know as the vocalist from Moonshine back on Chronologic. Also worth noting that his sections are actually a modern rendition of a 1940s track by gospel group Southern Sons called Baby Won't You Fall in Love. I'm not sure if they also sampled from that original song, but if not, it sounds pretty authentic to that era. The midway turning point technique strikes again on this next track, Reverse. as does the warm brassy section, which I mentioned back on Mad. Similar to Mirrors, I was a little concerned when I first heard this track because I was a little worried that it might signify that Caravan Palace was moving away from their classic jazzy sound when it first released. I remember hearing that teaser initially on their Instagram, which only showed the first few seconds with that really warm, broody brass intro. I was excited that, it might be a really kind of profound, deep track. And then it ended up being more of a kind of fun little radio tune. But, it has grown on me since, and I think now I'm happy to say that it is one of my favorites still of the album. As with Raccoons, I really love the vocal hook on this one. I think it's really catchy. And then also, as I said, that midway turning point where it switches up the chord progression about halfway through. That kind of enriched it a little bit for me and gave me a bit of replay value on it. Now, although I was a little lukewarm with this one and Mirrors when they first released, the next track, which was released as a single, really blew me away straight out of the gate, and that is Full. I think the reason I really loved this was just because I was waiting for something a bit more experimental and out there from Caravan Palace, because up until this point, all of those singles played it a little bit more safe, but this really delivered that for me in spades. In particular, I really love the sort of wobbly LFO synth in the drop, paired with that really elegant piano, and then eventually the brass they bring in the second chorus. Also a bit of fun trivia on this one. The last third of this track is actually taken from the 6th ID track of the Chill with Caravan Palace mix, specifically the brass sections that you hear in it. And then all of the vocals you hear in this track are directly sampled from a late 1960s track by Ella Washington called Doing the Best I Can. Interestingly, this was the only sample track that got credited on the in-album cover, I guess because it's a little bit more modern than all of the other ones. Moving right along to Spirits, this one intrigued me quite a bit lyrically. I think it's meant to be sung from the perspective of someone who's just become sober, but then you have these chants which are sung from the perspective of someone who's trying to tempt them into drinking alcohol. That was my interpretation of it, at least. Let me know what you think. I do think this is quite a novel idea, this idea of having a kind of argumentative dialogue back and forth between two parties. Sort of reminds me a little bit of what they did back on About You on Chronologic. And notably, it's also the first ever Caravan Palace track to use profanities, and I'll be honest, I don't generally listen to explicit music, call me a prude, whatever, but I'm also not one to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and honestly, outside of that, I really love this track. This would also be the most electronic track on the album, I'd say. Really, the most jazzy thing about it would be Robin Mansanti's vocals, who was that vocalist back on Moonshine again. And usually a lack of jazzy influences on a Caravan Palace track might be cause for concern for me, but honestly, on this one, I'm just a real sucker for that kind of rhythmic saw-wave synth, so I'm willing to let it slide here. Also, just a quick plug, by the way, I did make a clean version of this track, which you can check out here or via the link in the description. Getting into the last third of the album, the next track we have, Blond Dynamite, is a track I feel like I should love because it has lots of elements of a Caravan Palace track that I love, like a really bombacious kind of brass section, along with a sort of experimental section around the middle, but for whatever reason, I just couldn't connect with it as much. Maybe it's just that the chord progression and the melody just didn't hit as much for me on this one. It's still serviceable, but I think there are some other stronger contenders on the album. I think this one might also be explicit as well, but they didn't really label it as such. I guess it's not as noticeable as the previous track. Anyway, next track, Porto Billow, is clearly a development of the very first ID track of the Caravan Palace Chill Mix, along with a video, I think it was Caravan Palace in Washington on their YouTube channel from over a decade ago, which is kind of crazy. One of my favorite developments to this track since then is the addition of vocals, which once again samples from another old 1940s track, and I'll check the name here. It comes from Mildred Bailey's cover of When That Man Is Dead and Gone, which is originally a 1940s jazz song by Al Bali and Ginny Masseni. I apologize if I'm butchering that pronunciation. Back when I heard this in the Chill Mix, I was kind of lukewarm to it, but now that they've developed a little bit more with those very dreamy vocals, along with a sort of alternate trumpet section, I think I've really come to appreciate it a bit more. Moving on to the penultimate track, City Cook. I noticed a lot of people really seem to love this track, so I guess I'm in the minority here as I'm kind of lukewarm with it. I don't know, there just wasn't really anything in it that leapt out to me really. Like, it's a fun little ditty, but just nothing too ambitious, I found. I mean, I appreciate they've tried to capture the feel of a busy kitchen in the sound design, and even the lyrics have a bit of a theme and message behind them in this one. I think it's sort of about, not submitting to authoritative figures who are abusive towards you, which, if you're someone who happens to be in that position, you might connect with this song. But otherwise, again, kind of lukewarm for me. It just never really evolved that much, and I don't know, just wasn't as interesting. Finally, the last track on the album, Villa Rose, is a development of the third ID track from the Chill Mix. One of the first things you'll notice that they've changed here are those chords, which seem to have been changed to a more of a plucky sound with a bit of delay on it, which I really love. They also seem to have pitched the entire track down a semitone, I guess to really bring out the low frequencies of that piano arpeggio that goes throughout the entire track. This one actually is the least popular track, at least on the Spotify, and I have to disagree, honestly. I really enjoy this one, and just especially how it builds throughout that second half in texture. Once again, when this was in the chill mix, I was a little more so-so on it, but now I really love it, and just how uplifting it gets in that second half especially. Also have to give a shout out to the pitch-bendy steel guitar that they've used to replace the vocals from the chill mix. I don't know about you, but that just instantly reminds me of SpongeBob. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the album, and honestly, overall, I would say this is definitely a win of an album. Really an album full of hit after hit. Most of them on this I really enjoyed. From a level of pure enjoyment, I would put this like on par with Robot Face, which is my other like favorite Caravan Palace album, so it's pretty good. I would say from an artistic level, I do feel like this one is less of an evolution of Caravan Palace's sound. They're kind of retreading more familiar ground here as opposed to really exploring new frontiers, but you know, as a celebratory album, really love it. It'd also be the album I think I'd feel the most comfortable showing my friends, interestingly, who don't know Caravan Palace or, you know, don't usually listen to this kind of music. Just because structurally and in the sound design, I feel like it's probably the most radio-friendly, most familiar to people, but also at the same time without sacrificing that crucial character. Like many, I was also really glad to see the inclusion of various ID tracks from the chill mix. You know, they missed a couple of my favorites, but whatever. I think what they've done with the ones they have included, they vastly improved them, so definitely a win. Anyway, that's about all I have to say. Overall, love the album, definite win. If you're interested, I'll be doing a bunch of piano tutorials covering the entire album over the coming weeks. I've already covered about half of it if you're interested in that. But otherwise, feel free to like, subscribe, bell, and I'll see you around. Ciao!